great pleasure, and first of all, it's a great honor to lecture before such an audience. I would like to say some nice thank you to Marianne Miller and Yorkshire. They helped me here. I feel so warm that I will. It won't be nice to leave tomorrow. So it was really great. And in the beginning, I will maybe, to introduce you, I will as well have to explain my languages skill. I know it's recorded, so I was a little bit stressed because I knew then that people will listen it and make fun of me. So I'm as a kind of Eastern European-born man in the communistic times, I didn't have such an opportunity to learn English as, I don't know, many other international scholars. I will discuss today the negative, but kind of not usual vision of or understanding of negative itself. I won't speak only about negative as a kind of intermediate stage or kind of agent or kind of go-between or plate or a helper to get right positive image, as we used to treat negative in history as a kind of helper only. I will try to concentrate on the history of negative images that were actually finished. So when artists decide to stop with the stage of negative, or when artists decided to print negative prints. So in my understanding, negatives means as well kind of convention when on the picture lights are dark, and darkness is like with white and bright colors. So we will discuss this negativity in a little bit non-common, non-typical way. I will concentrate on, I will try to show you as well kind of different history of photography. So when my title is kind of tricky, because as you see it's negative history or negative in history. The first one I explained, like trying to show you this presence of negative pictures in history of photography. But on the other hand, when we look on history of photography, it's always kind of subjective. So it's dependent on many things, like, I don't know, French photography historian, they will always start from Niepce and Daguerre. I don't know, I remember, for example, one German or rather Austrian history of photography that obviously started from Johann Heinrich Schulze. So it's something that is always in a kind of involved in kind of politics. And on the other hand, we can see this history when we start looking at it from other angle as well. My angle is from the negative point of view, and introducing negative could change a little bit this history of photography that we probably, all of us probably know quite well. First of all, I will talk about the short history. I will try to present it to you quite shortly, with as well explaining some meanings. What is important for discussing the negative is also something that is always the problem of contemporary theory of photography. In this case, I mean relation between photograph and reality. So it is often a point of discussion, and we will try to discuss it from the little bit different angle, as I said, from the point of negative. So how this negative picture refers to reality, what does it mean, how this relation look like. And then I will switch to the formal consequences of using negative. So what's actually changed when artists decide to use negative? We'll compare as well some negative and positive pictures, trying to analyze as well space, for example, of the picture, which always differs in these two kinds of pictures. And then I will try to go maybe a little bit more theoretical to the question of truth. It's another very important ontological problem that is often explained or discussed by different photography historians like Roland Barthes or I don't know, André Bazin. Many of them discuss this question of truth, so it's important to look at as well a little bit different through these lenses of negative. Then I will try to change it for a little bit different kind of tale about negative. I mean, I will try to show you different examples from history of photography, showing as well fields, semantic fields, when this negative is used by an artist. I mean by that, what negative symbolize? There are some groups that we can show. So, for example, this problem of true is sometimes artists decide to use negative when they want to say something about true, but evil, for example, could be another meaning, another part of another field when artists decide to use negative picture for his works. From this last I would say symbolic field of using negatives, will go as well to the questions of so-called symbolic inversion. I will try to explain it to you for in the end. And as well, maybe if we have time, I will try to show as well some feminist, or maybe showing the negative as a kind of tool that allow us to discuss with some patriarchal stereotypes in history of art. It's also common ground for contemporary art history. What I'm trying to avoid in my discussion over negative, it's kind of, let's say, very modernist use. And I mean by that this field when artists decide to use negative only because it's something like, let's say, beautiful, or something that could be interesting from the aesthetic point of view. The example of such a use could be observed, for example, in Fotografie, subjektive photography in Germany of 50s, when this meanings that were so important before were vanishing quite slowly. I will show you as well many pictures to present as much as possible visions and way of using this this negativity in a history of photography. So, starting from the beginning, we have to again come back to the beginning of photography. And as photography and its history is very much positive-centric. It's a difficult term, I know, but in the contemporary theory we have often something like, for example, male-centric, which is obviously criticized by feminist theoreticians. We have something that we could call as well light-centric culture. So everything is taken from the light, like with light we have the notion of God, for example, good as well, so some ethic values as well. And on the other hand, we have this bipolar structure when always on the other side there are some opposites, like for, I don't know, God, there is a devil; for good, there is an evil; for man, there is a woman, and so on and so forth. So our civilization was concentrated on this light values, and many notions coming from this light point of view. As well, history of photography is a little bit positive centric, so it's connected with this light images quite strong. But actually, when we look closer, history of photography as let's say as well as kind of some of myths that concern beginning of the world in general, it starts from darkness actually. So we can say that actually this Johann Heinrich Schulze that I already mentioned, he found something that he didn't expect, but it started photography. So it was this darkness that, or maybe dark writing, that he discovered, and he didn't know what to do with it. It was actually as well described because he was searching for kind of a light bearer, as he mentioned in his notebook, like Lichtträger in German. I don't know if I spelled it well, but he get only darkness bearer, so Dunkelheitsträger. And he was disappointed over it. So he got something that carried darkness, and that was kind of beginning. He didn't know what to do with it. He lived it, he avoided, and for the next 100 years, people didn't know what to do with such a discovery. We can, by observing what's happened in this beginnings, we can as well say that this darkening on because of light is was even known before. Like some artists and photography historian mentioned this chemicals, for example, with the snail used in antiques, like Murex trunculus, as well Murex brandaris. There were snails that produced this strange dye that darkened on the exposure to light. So it was this light sensitivity, but always make kind of reaction on light which caused this darkness. So the darkness is kind of in the beginning of photography. I will show now kind of short piece of a letter by Samuel Morse. He wrote it down to his nephew, if I remember well, but it was in the moment when he first time had occasion to see daguerreotypes, and he wrote something like, I will try to read it, but I suppose you can read it by yourself, but I will be able to maybe emphasize some fragments which are important to me. It is one of the most beautiful discoveries of the age. I don't know if you recollect some experiments of mine in New Haven many years ago, experiments to ascertain if it were possible to fix the image of the camera obscura. I was able to produce different degrees of shade on paper, dipped into a solution of nitrate of silver, but means of different degrees of light. But finding the light produced dark and dark light, I presumed the production of a true image to be impracticable, and gave up the attempt. So it's another one, and we have already like 1839, so the year when photography were announced to the world. Another actually great scientist, great mind, didn't know what to do with this negative invention. He invented even before. He mentioned it in his letter. It's not, I didn't show you it because I wanted to emphasize that he was before Talbot or something, but what was important here, that this he didn't know what to do with this darkness. So he got this darkness and he didn't know what to do with it. So using these cases, these descriptions, like this I mentioned before, for example, Schulze, what he meant about negative as something that won't be used by him because he don't know what to do with it. We have the same opinion by, for example, Niepce in France in the beginning of 19th century, when he wrote in 1816 to his brother, describing negative as well as a problem, as something that is error for him, and he have to fight to find this right positive image. So we have this darkness as a beginning. What is important in this I describe you by now is maybe something that allows us to answer for so-called Gernsheim dilemma. And Gernsheim dilemma was a kind of question that was posed by Helmut Gernsheim, one of photography historians. He was wondering why photography was discovered so late. His answer, an answer that many other photography historians agree, was that actually it was because society was ready in this particular 30s when they needed photography for their use. But it's obviously true. But another thing that should be mentioned, trying to solve this dilemma, it's actually that after camera obscura and as well chemistry, which were two elements that combining together create photography, we have to add as well this problem with negativity, which was very difficult to overcome for all the photographers before. So we have, for example, daguerreotype, which is still negative. So it's it can be kind of surprising for you that in every dictionary, almost every, because I found one which said that daguerreotype is positive, but usually daguerreotypes are described as negative images as well, because they produce or they reflect this reaction on light, which happens darkness. So we have only darkening by causing by medium of light on this plate. So we see the plate, and then we have this illusion of positivity, negativity, like it can change in every angle, but actually in the process it's negative itself. So it was the first step to overcome this problem that shown before. So we could see it on the right angle to see this positive image that everybody was waiting for. Another one was obviously discovery by William Henry Fox Talbot, who in 1835 first one described this possibility of reversing negative to positive. So he wrote something like that, that if you have this first image, which is actually negative, in his notebook from 35, you can get the positive one if you will copy it again on your paper. That's how the photography starts. So it starts from this darkness, it starts from negativity, it starts as well from this fight of overcoming negativity. So as I said before, like in some Jewish Christian mythology, we have this everything starts from darkness that was like lightened. Then we have this similarity here, like the negativity that is overcome by positivity. So it's kind of turning point in 39 when the photography take a new step in history. Obviously, since the beginning, we can observe many different uses of photography, as well as negative itself. We can call as well negatives to such a photogenic drawing, so-called. So the pictures where there's no cameraless picture, or as they were later called in 20s and 30s, they are photograms or radiograms or shadowgraphy, depends on inventor of this kind of way of thinking. But they are negatives as well. I will show you in some seconds kind of picture which was pattern for describing negative for William Henry Fox Talbot, and here's this kind of thinking. So negative, it's kind of white on black, when shadow in this case, we see the white shadows with something that is has this, let's say, it's contradictory in its inside. Another person that should be mentioned in this context is John Herschel, close friend of William Henry Fox Talbot. He was actually defining this negativity and positivity, and these are here you have his definition of negative and positive during his presentation before the Royal Society, if I remember well. So to avoid much circumlocution, it might be allowed me to employ the terms positive and negative to express respectively pictures in which the lights and shades are as in nature or as in the original model, and in which they are the opposite. And what is important as well in this definition, that he mentioned that actually with negativity we have this, let's say, geometrical inversion of light, left and right, which is always switched as well. So this is short definition, and what is important to emphasize in this case is actually that he uses language that was very typical for science of this 40s. The words negative, positive were applied obviously in mathematics, but as well in physics, especially in discussion about electromagnetism. So it was kind of new subject to discuss. So many different scholars in those times used this notions of negative, positive to describe different phenomena of physics as well. And because they were popular and very precise description, this mathematical roots will be important for photography and for this history of negative and positive in the future years. But actually the best, the most, let's say, literal definition of negative we can find in a famous issue of William Henry Fox Talbot, I mean the Pencil of Nature, where with the plate 20, you see this plate 20, he described what he meant by negative. It's the longest as well definition, so I'll read it, you can read it with me, as this is the first example of a negative image that has been introduced into this work. It might be necessary to explain in a few words what is meant by the expression and wherein the differences consist. The ordinary effect of light upon white sensitive paper is blackening. If therefore any object, as a leaf for instance, by lead upon the paper, this, by intercepting the action of the light, preserve the whiteness of the paper beneath it. And accordingly, when it is removed, there appears the form of shadow of the leaf marked out in white upon the blackened paper. And since shadows are usually dark, and this is the reverse, It is called, in the language of photography, a negative image. This exemplified by the lace depicted in this place. Each copy of it being an original or negative image, that is to say, directly taken from the lace itself. Now, if instead of copying the lace we were to copy one of these negative images of it, the result will be a positive image of the lace. That is to say, the lace would be represented black upon a white ground. But in this secondary or positive image, the representation of the small delicate threads which compose the lace would not be quite so sharp and distinct, owing to its not being taken directly from the original. In taking views of buildings, statues, portraits, etc., it is necessary to obtain positive image, because the negative image of such objects are hardly intelligible, substaining light for shadow and vice versa. But in copying such things as lace or leaves of plants, a negative image is perfectly allowable, black lace being as familiar to the eye as white lace, and the objects being only to exhibit the pattern with accuracy. What is important about this definition, there are some parts that should be actually emphasized to make it clear. Actually, in this long part of Pencil of Nature, William Fox Talbot never mentioned the proper color of the lace. We don't know if it was actually red or white or maybe black or gray. We don't know. Actually, he doesn't talk about it like in relation to reality, but only to the effect and his, let's say, readability. So if it's readable for the eye, if it's familiar to the eye, as he described it in the last senses. So negative is when light produces dark, dark produces light. It has nothing to do with reality itself. So we don't know actually if this lace was black. It could be black, and the effect is the most important thing. Interesting about this lace is as well that I always try to, before reading or explaining the facts, I try to ask my students always if they think it's positive or negative. Most of them obviously say that this is positive lace, but it's not, as I said, it was kind of example of this negativity described by Talbot. Another important thing about this definition is that Talbot emphasized that we don't have to reverse it to positive. So it's perfectly enough having it like that. Everybody sees that it's lace, so we don't have to switch it again. He gives as well another examples of such a use. For example, leaves doesn't have to be reversed like we had here before, kind of leaf that in a positive and negative image will look probably more or less the same. So it could be negative as a final picture as well for Talbot. What he mentioned as well is that actually negative is as well a little bit more detailed. It was due to a technical process that in those time of Talbot he was using negatives which were paper, so it was hard to get like this transparency that we know from later glass or cellulose negatives. To compare it, I can show you for a while this positive material that could be compared with the lace. So we have white ground and black fabric, which allow us to call it as a positive image. So this use mentioned by Talbot in his definition of negativity could be observed as well in the works of other photographers from 40s, especially like Anna Atkins, for example. He used it like, she used it like just putting the different specimens of plants on the photographic paper. In this case, cyanotype, so the technique invented by John Herschel that I mentioned before. And as a result, we have this negative image that you can see over here. So we see the white shape of the object on the dark background, and it's perfectly enough, obviously, in their understanding for the 19th century scientists who could do all the work, who could, I don't know, make some taxonomical description, make kind of systematization, classification, as usually scientists did in those times. Such a technique, as you know, probably it was used as well in so-called blueprints. It's always surprising for me because I know that they were very common in United States, but I don't know how it's in Switzerland, because in Poland I have never seen blueprints at all. And I know that Americans use this kind of blueprint for synonymous of project in general, which is kind of surprising for my point of view. But they were cyanotypes, and what is important in this case that it maybe shows a little bit abstract vision. So vision that is typical for scientists. So like, for example, Röntgen pictures, we don't see accurate, direct reality. But for every scientist who work with Röntgen pictures, it's perfectly readable what is going on this. It doesn't have to be so direct. The same case we have with negatives, which allow to concentrate on some formal details of the object, as well like in this project, it's kind of abstract way of thinking about the word. So the same examples from entomology, for example, like this leaf, this wings of butterfly probably, or some other insect. It's shown here as a negative, and it's as well perfectly enough for the scientists to see the differences of this particular specimen. It's not over. When we talk about this beginnings of photography, we have to say that for first 20 years, photography searched for its place. So it was applied in many different levels, even the levels that could sound a little bit funny for us, but still in the 50s there was very strong movement of so-called mission héliographique in France. And heliographists, as we could say in English, they were using paper negatives. So it was process invented by Talbot, later called like calotype. Then heliographie in France, as Michel Friseau, one of the few photography historians that wrote a little bit about negative, he pointed out that actually for heliographists, important thing was to working with negatives to obtain beautiful negatives. So negative was a little bit end for many of the negative for many of the heliographist works. And here we have kind of example of this. Henri Lessec, one of the most important heliographists, he was so much in love in this convention that he often stopped on this stage. Like here we have kind of landscape in negative that could be as well treated as a night view. That was kind of a new thing. So it was obviously difficult in those times to get proper night views. So such a paper negative could be treated as well as a night panorama of the cities, as well perfectly readable. We can read almost every detail of it. It can even be compared with some old paintings where cities were night cities were depicted in a very similar way. As I said, he was so much in love with negative convention that he used it even in engravings. So we have some engravings that imitate the effect of negativity. Like here we see the monk that just repeat this convention, and as well in many cases we still have some paper negatives like here with still life, for example. It's perfectly enough. Some of them were reversed, some of them, as I said before, mostly kept in Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where scientists, researchers always emphasize that he just liked to stop on the stage and leave it as a negative, as something that is perfectly done. Gustave Leclerc was another French photographer that did something like Henri Lessec. And another important fact from the 19th century history of photography that is important as well for the history of negativity is invention of so-called solarization or Sabatier effect. It's difficult to describe how to produce such images, but you probably know better than I, as most of you are photographers. And it's kind of double exposure, but the second one is during the process of development. So it produced the image which is, we can say, ambivalent in its structure. I mean by that is partly negative, partly positive. And as an effect discovered just in the beginning, even in the 40s, some photographers already noticed that it could be produced something like that. Later in end of 50s, it was well described by this Sabatier in France, and then used, for example, in as a kind of formal effect by surrealists. For example, here we have Man Ray portraits of André Breton from 30s. And then we have a little bit gap. So, as I said before, 20 years of wondering where photography could be applied, how we can use it, and then long break because negative found its place. So it was the place that I already described. It was the place as a kind of, as I said before, intermediate stage or agent or go-between or only plate, which is generally treated as something which is wrong. It's something bad with the image, is reversed, so many photographers even decide to destroy it after they printed their positives, so right prints. And this gap is taking place until 20s, where during the avant-garde movement, like in New Vision movement, for example, in Russia, or in Bauhaus, as well in Holland, in Surrealism as well, in Dadaism, we can find many examples of negative pictures as well. It was a little bit rediscovery of this beginning. So the medium searched for its own properties, its own features. pictures modernism starts, but there were as well some avant-garde parts of this kind of thinking. We can observe over here like one of the many examples from those times in Bauhaus school in Dessau. Probably because it was like the second part of 20s. Ludwig Hirschfeld Mark had his class that he explained these differences, and we can obviously see these differences over here. Like for example, this square in left image seems to be, it's not square, it's circle. In the left image seems to be a little bit smaller than this in the right one. It's the effect known since 15th century. That could be as well explained by different negative and positive examples of the same image. So similar works were done by L. Lisiecki, for example, with like here we have another photographs showing these tools and wires from 29. What is important for us when we look closer to the space of this image, it differs really very much. Like this left one, we see something that is placed on the ground. So these tools, this wire seems to be lying on the ground. On the right image, the same object seems to be like levitating in the air, like levitating in a kind of limbo, dark limbo. So the space of negative and positive differs very much, and it was very often part of discussion of theoreticians in the 20s and 30s working with different kind of photography. Obviously, it was often used as well by some photographers as a formal effect. Here we have kind of Edmund Kesting, not well known, but very good German photographer. Here with some photographs of dancer Dore Hoyer. We see actually 3 pictures of Dore Hoyer. Here, this is the second one, so it's kind of superimposition of the pictures. And as well, in this particular case, this is 40s already, but the picture is from the book by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, one of the most important photographer of Bauhaus, of this movement of avant-garde. Vision in Motion, that the book was called, already edited in the United States when Laszlo Moholy-Nagy immigrated. And it shows kind of advertisement, probably of painkillers, when we can see the body, naked body, which I will go back in the end of my presentation. So we see this naked body that maybe here reminds us a little bit Röntgen picture. So we see the shape, we don't see details. And first of all, it's not like erotical, pornographical picture, so it does not stimulate our vision, but it just shows this abstract point on the shape of the body. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy describes it very, very well. Here we have as well another thing about negativity that could be mentioned in this case. I mean negative sculptures. So the whole movement of art of beginning of 20th century, it was a little bit anti-conventional. Many artists just emphasize as avant-garde, usually did like their anti-conventional attitude. So here we have something which is not actually only negative, but it's more like ambivalent sculpture. So the head is obviously kind of empty. The corpse is full, so we have this play between full and empty over here with some classical subject as woman combine her hair from Alexander Archipenko from 1915. many similar sculptures can be found among this young generation of sculptors as well in by Pablo Picasso from the beginning of 20th century. And another example that could be shown in this context is Robert Cumming. We are in United States in 70s. Two pictures, but I always use them to show as well some different in presenting space in the context of negative in positive. It's quite a nice play with negativity and positivity. We have this blackboard with white chalk, which usually was used in those times in schools and universities. So let's say automatically everything was explained by the examples of negatives, and nobody, everything was readable anyway. Here we have this designs as well, these drawings that are done on this blackboard, and by the differences we can observe these differences of light and space in negative, in positive picture. Interesting fragments are, for example, that this box seems to be empty over here. Look like we can look inside when we look at as a kind of final picture. Here we have like full cube, and another one is here, like looking like hole a little bit. Here we don't have this effect of hole. And the most important are obviously direction of the light. Here we have even this direction marked by these vectors. But when we see positive, it's alright, this direction with light and shadow is working over here. But when we look on the negative example, it seems to be like lightened under the from under the floor, like from down. So direction of the light is opposite, and this is very typical thing for negative pictures. They always present objects as a kind of levitating in the ground because of this light going from down. And as well some color pictures. These are already paintings by Eberhard Havekost, quite well-known contemporary German painter. This diptych was presented in Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. So we can as well see the way how negative was used by different artists in the 20s and 30s. Here we have, for example, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy that I mentioned here many times, with some portraits, negative portraits, but as well with some, let's say, more idyllic pictures representing people in the lying somewhere in the nature, and as well some pictures that could be juxtaposed with some of the, for example, Ludwig Hirschfeld-Mack that I showed you before, or this Lisicki tool and wire, because Laszlo Moholy-Nagy just brought such a pictures to his class, explaining this difference that we are talking about here, some spatial differences between negative and positive image. All these pictures I showed you here, they represent the movement of so-called new vision. So this new vision was created, first of all, to be different from the past vision, to be something typical for the new world, for the world after the revolution, for the world when, after First World War, we tried to see the civilization from the new modern point of view. Negative was one of the formal formal, let's say, language to obtain such a task of this new vision in 20s. As you see on many examples we observe over here, many of these photographs are perfectly readable for us, but not always seems to be true. But we can pose this question about true, and often different photography historian refer to the problem of true, underlining, for example, similarity. So if the picture is similar to reality, it could be like truthful. We can discuss this or maybe contradict this with different pictures that are that seems to be identical to reality and are not true at all. First of all, because we are not able to compare picture with reality. We watch the pictures. Reality, when we watch the pictures, no matter if they are paintings or photographs, does not exist anymore. So another notion that is often mentioned in discussion about true is objectivity. It's something behind human or man will. So, like in the beginning, when photography appeared, it was often emphasized that it's a medium that allows us to get this objective vision of the world. So, the artist has nothing to say with the picture. Only the sun is kind of creator. It's all happened automatically, so beyond the power of the photographers. We know perfectly that manipulation is as old as photography itself, so we can discuss this objectivity of positive images that were easily could be manipulated since the first photographs were taken. Even daguerreotypes were a little bit scratched and painted by the photographers in the first days of existing photography. So it's not that it's so automatical, and this manual work was often involved in working with photography. Another notion is documentary and or document. Document is kind of late notion that was defined in the context of photography more in beginning of 20th century. In 1910 there was kind of a symposium in Belgium, in Brussels, when some theoreticians discussed what we can call actually documentary, and they agreed that actually documentary will be something that is sharp, full of details, and it can be used in the scientific research. So it is not mentioned if it's positive, negative. So for example, a Röntgen picture is something that could be treated as a, even if it's negative, it could be treated as something documentary, as well as this, let's say, for example, wing of insects by Talbot. They are as well sharp, full of details, and some scientists could use it. So documentary is often used as a notion connected with true, but often as well as a kind of objectivity, as an example of objectivity. And the last notion important to explain what true in photography is the notion of index or indexical, and it's kind of difficult, so I ask you for your attention if you don't know the theory of science by Peirce. So Peirce make kind of structure of science showing three types of science. The first type of science is iconic. Iconic is the sign when the object from the picture or from the sign is similar to the reality in its view. So that's how John Herschel probably looked. So it's kind of iconic sign of John Herschel. Here, Charles Sanders Peirce with another group. I mean here by symbolic images, symbolic signs, that symbols doesn't look like something that it refers to. So it's not the image how United States look like, but it symbolizes United States. So it's kind of symbolic image of United States. The third kind of image is so-called indexical sign, which characteristics are direct physical contact with its reference. So in this case, the hand is little bit similar to the hand itself, but the sign was created by direct contact. So George Grosz, because it's his hand, just take a hand and make like that on kind of probably coal background and get this image footstep, for example, in the sand. It's kind of indexical sign, or just indexes when you, I don't know, when you are criminals, for example, and go to the police and you need to leave your indexes of your fingers. That means the direct contacts of your body, and the sign refers like that, not by similarity, but by its physical contact. So many photography historians emphasize that photography is kind of indexical science, even Charles Sanders Peirce said that actually index could be explained by the example of photography. But the problem is that what we call index could be observed only in negatives itself, because they are kind of first images. So this is the first touch of the sun, which is here taken. We can discuss indexical signs as well with daguerreotypes, with Polaroids, when there is no between, when there's nothing between. So in other cases, like in positive images taken by the help of negative in this two-step process, we can say that positive, it's not indexical sign as many theoreticians emphasize, but it's actually kind of index of index. So it's kind of double index, which it's not that obvious. So in my opinion, and it's not only mine, because it was like underlined by many artists as well, negatives are closer to the true, because they are just this first sign. They illustrate this question of the indexicality a little bit better. And here we have a kind of examples that allow us to discuss with this history of notion of truth. For example, manipulated document, we see Adolf Hitler with some disappearing people around. It was typical for totalitarian photography. So imagine a situation when some historian gets only this picture. They will treat it as a kind of documentary. So without this original picture, or without negatives, we won't find how the true actually looked like. The negative was much more closer to this real image and allow us to show what's actually happened. And as well, some paintings that has nothing to do to photography. So when we talk about, for example, similarity as a question of truth, here we have this similarity in painting, so it's nothing photographical in it. The, let's say, interesting thing for photography research, and as well maybe for some religious people, could be Shroud of Turin. Interesting example of the question of truth as well. It's a kind of different kind of true, let's say, because and it's kind of important question that none of theoretician of photography mentioned what kind of truth he's actually discussing or comparing to photography. So the truth is a kind of notion that is often repeated in a more political way, like politics. They often say that it is true, it's not true, but they do not refer to the philosophical notion or particular philosophical notion of truth. We have done so many that it should be mentioned. And one of the truth is obviously ontological truth that could be observed in some negatives as well. And it was kind of situation from end of 19th century when Italian photographer Secondo Pia was asked to reproduce Shroud of Turin. What he did was, first of all, this we can see it on the right picture. He had taken first negative glass plate of it. And when he saw this negative plate, he was really surprised, as the word as well, because on this negative plate of Shroud of Turin, he saw positive face of Jesus, as believers underlined. So we have this positive face on the negative image. It's kind of tricky, and you see even this my subtitles of these images could be kind of complicated, like positive print with negative face and negative print with positive face. So it's all kind of tricky. But the interesting thing about it is kind of, let's say, getting to true by negative. So this face appeared in negativity, no matter what we are thinking about the religious or questions of our believing if it's really the face of Jesus or not. For me, important was that it appears in negative. In negative, we thanks to negative, we can perceive it and see it. And this metaphysical truth, it's often mentioned by different photographers. As example, I used Jerzy Lewczyński, you probably don't know his name. He lives in Poland. He's very old, and in 70s he created kind of movement or kind of series called Archaeology of Photography, where he started to search for just lost or abandoned photographs. There were some negatives he found, and after the negatives he found in New York, he created kind of series exposing them to the world. He as well wrote many texts about the negative itself, always underlining that actually we have this true witness, negative as a true witness of reality. So that's why we should protect it. It was very, let's say, modern, because in 70s, 80s, nobody actually thought about negatives itself. Museums still were not interested in gathering them, as well as markets. You could go to the Sotheby with negatives of the most famous photographer, and nobody will be interested in buying them for, I don't know, $100. So it was kind of paradox around that, and Lewczyński was one of the first interested in its structure, showing as well this right series was inspired by the film Blow Up of Michelangelo Antonioni, that you probably all watch. We have this blow up on the right picture. Here we start, and this last 20 minutes I will show you different kind of application of negative by different artists. And as we discuss these roots of negativity in history, I mentioned that it was very much connected to the problem of electromagnetism. Here we have, for example, the series by Man Ray. It was kind of, let's say, advertisement or maybe kind of project that he was paid for by electric company of Paris or kind of company like that he created kind of portfolio of images that refer to this problem of electricity. And obviously he used a lot negativity or as well some bipolar images, so images that were ambivalent, positive, negative in one composition. Like here we have the positive picture of the moon, and the negative, it's kind of radiogram or photogram again of this switch. And as a planet or planetoid, moon has its own polars itself. Could be interesting in this case. So, general, it starts or it shows here that negative can be applied when some bipolar problems are in the middle of attention of particular artists. Negative and positive itself, like in here, in this Barbara Kruger poster, famous poster, Your Body is a Battleground. It was published in kind of during kind of abortion discussion in United States, if I remember well. But what is important for this kind of poster, it's that it shows very chessboard-like way of thinking about the world. So we have the chessboard, when we have white and black soldiers fighting together on the black and white world. So it's kind of a very simple way of thinking on the world as a good and evil. It's really not complex, very old ontological system that maybe is kind of as well basement of Western civilization. As an interesting fact, such a poster could be inspired, for example, by some futurist photographs, like here, Spectralization of Ego by Maggiorino Gramaglia. And here we have something that happened in Poland that as well can show the similar way of thinking. So we have this kind of chessboard, but now inspired by, in this case, it's just inspired by the novel you all perfectly know. I mean here, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So we have this Mr. Jekyll, Dr. Hyde. It's here Dr. Garlicki, Mr. Łapówka. Łapówka is kind of money that you will get as well surgeon of some of the politician of 2006 or something. So he was presented in this front cover of the magazine in this context of Stevenson novel, referring obviously to this word combining good and evil side of human beings. So here we have this positive and negative image. What is interesting to say that in this novel there is description of the substance that Dr. Jekyll had to drink before he gets evil, and this substance is described as a pink getting green, so it's kind of oppositional. This green is kind of negative of pink, so this way of thinking could be something that can be mentioned in this case. And we have really big archive of Franz Roch. He was not that famous, he was more famous as a curator or editor in 20s, art historian as well, but for a short time he created many pictures like that, which have something that could be compared with kind of emotional, melancholical state. This picture is very romantic, it can be not even juxtaposed with some romantic pictures. We have this graveyard with some lonely people. people over here, so it's very like metaphysical in a case. And Franz Rock himself described it as something that represents the word in a minor key. So as in music we have minor and major. Minor is always kind of more sadness. It represents more sadness than major. Franz Rock described it that photographers could always easily switch from this minor to major key, choosing between negative or positive convention. But this picture refers to death. So death is as another side to life. Creates another opposition for us. So our, let's say, earthly living is something positive, something which happened on the other side could be treated as a negative. So this shows as well this complexity of Turin Shroud, that it shows this like Christ on the other side, or the other face of Christ, but often we have examples of using negativity in this context of death. Like here we have, for example, Wander and Coke, or on the other hand, anti-war photo montage by Alexander Rodchenko from Turkey. That was kind of inscription under the picture that says medals and awards for generals and military graveyard for soldiers. So we have it clearly depicted. These generals are on this left side. The normal, typical soldiers are on the right side. The soldiers are represented in negative with graveyard in between. What is important for these pictures is this explosion, which shows actually that it's kind of break between these two parts of military, and as well this tank over here, it seems to be sent by the generals in the direction to the soldiers on the right. So that is again with negativity. But what is tricky in this picture is that actually we have negatives on the good side. So it's kind of complexity. They are bad, so they are positive. They are good, so they are negative. So it's kind of oppositional to the usual way of seeing these problems. And here we have, for example, another Alexander Rodchenko war pictures from famous journal, magazine Zarubieżon from 30s. And this complexity that I just mentioned, so that this white-black, it's not that easy system, or to use very difficult word, it's not so Manichaeistic from Manichaeism, kind of religious system that was created when everything was treated as a chessboard, black and white, good and evil, God and devil, and so on and so forth. So contemporary culture show us more and more that the world is much more complex. And here we have, for example, Jean-Luc Godard film called Alphaville, when this world is very much bipolar. So the strange mathematical city with computer as a kind of god of this city. It's very bipolar. The main protagonist of this movie is like traveling from north to south and so on and so forth. And sometimes when strange things happen, like, I don't know, he's killing somebody, the picture changes from negative to positive. So it's kind of as well formal play or some formal effects that happen. In this case, we see here Eddie Constantin as Lemmy Caution in Alphaville by Godard, and some other pictures of it. And it's kind of long tradition of showing negatives with the question of that. The most important for me was Nosferatu, eine Symphonie des Grauens. from 1922, where Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau showed this complexity of the story of vampire as a kind of negative creature, dead creature as well, representing this guy who is going to visit Nosferatu for some interest. He is going to this bridge. The farmer who brings him to this bridge is too afraid to go longer. So the bridge is kind of the space in between. It's between this negativity and positivity. It's in between this space of God and evil, or good and evil. And when he are traveling then by the special car that was sent for him, he feel kind of headache. He doesn't know what's wrong with him. And just in front of castle, the pictures turn to negative. So underlying this negative space, it's very short, subtle moment of this movie. Meanwhile, he passes as well this kind of chapel, which represents as well kind of let's say religion that is opposite to this devil that he's going to visit, and it goes all came from this very old system that could be illustrated here. We see something from 17th century. It's kind of engraving from Otto van Veen, Amoris Divini Emblemata, the kind of book with emblemats. Here you have moon and sun, man and woman, dark and light, and so on and so forth. Above all, we have this ulster flying with this time. I don't know what the proper word for this time counter is. It's kind of old clock that we have, symbolizing time in general. Yeah, probably. But it all showed this bipolar system that our civilization was referring to even far before photography was invented. We can look on the other examples of such a way of thinking, like two between many those by Hans Bellmer were negatives as well. So it shows this, let's say, difficult psychological state often emphasized and described by his art historian working on Hans Bellmer as a kind of surrealist artist. And the most striking examples, these are kind of documentary work in a way of Auschwitz concentration camp made by Henry Rees. He was a photographer immigrating to the United States, where he made many portraits of famous people. He cooperated with some famous magazines. In 90s, he visited Auschwitz for a few times, and afterwards he edited kind of book called Auschwitz, where even typography of the layout of the book is created on this negative and positive side of the of it, when the right one is always negative, representing, like here, some pictures from the Auschwitz exposition. Here we have famous cans with that before contained gas, with some commentaries directly taken from the Nazis. So these are some opinions of Nazis on the black background. I didn't saw in my life many cases where artists use fisheye effect in a proper way. It's only one I can explain. It's something behind it, because it shows in this case it's Birkenau field. So another part of this complex is of concentration camps in Poland. But by this effect, it shows kind of global, let's say, situation using this effect. And this is a picture from the left side of the book, where contemporary living people, visitors, workers of Auschwitz are depicted with their opinions. So when we have on the right some Nazi or Lager commandant Höss in this case with these negative pictures of exposition, on the left we have this positive, so this polarity is very clear. What is the most striking for me is this picture, that actually in negative it shows fire again. So something that will disappear when we will turn it to positive. There won't be any. I try to switch it to positive, but it doesn't work. Okay, no, I would break something, so I won't do it. But in positive, it looks like normal destroyed house. In negatives, it recalls us this crematorium where people were burned with some fire in it. So it's kind of meaning that are after the images. And some of the images are, it's difficult to say if they are negative or positive even. These are hairs collected by the Nazi to produce some pillows or things comparable. Things. This question of positivity and negativity appears as well in the contemporary works by one of the best Polish contemporary artists, Zbigniew Libera, a famous series called Positives from 2002. This is this one upstairs, when he recreate the cliché that exists in our minds, minds of everybody who knows the right picture that he's referring to. So this is this positive. People are laughing, gathering together like inhabitants of some common building. They were just woke up, like it's morning, it's cold. They have this this clothing. They are, I don't know, happy. Nothing wrong is going on. And on the other hand, our mind has this cliché of the image afterwards. This postmodern quotation was created, and as well. Electric chair, as it has in Andy Warhol case many different faces. Here is one of them, which is negative. It could be compared as well to this problem of death. I will switch now to the almost the last problem that I would like to discuss is symbolic inversion. So symbolic inversion is something when, for example, the examples are, for example, if child teach parent, or woman beats a man, or like in this case, an animal become a butcher. So it's something that it's oppositional. It was very often used in imagination, in old imagination, as well as in kind of carnival tradition, when during the carnival the priest can be like normal citizen, and as well the prince, for example, like the woman can wear men clothes and opposite. So it's something that involves rites of reversal, and very important figure for this carnivalist rites are oxymorons in literature. For example, if you read Michał Bachtin that describes what carnavalization in this context of symbolic inversion means, he described it as well as oxymoronic. So it's something that is contradictory in its meaning. For example, dark sun. It's something that is oxymoronic, we can call it oxymoronic. So here we have something that can be oxymoronic, and it's similar to Michael Jackson. So we have black, white. In Michael Jackson, it was a little bit opposite to it, but here we have something that happened in Rodchenko work for Syphilis book by Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky described difficult life of black people in United States. And Rodchenko, by the photomontages like that, wanted to show that actually it's only not United States which system is unfair for people, creating kind of vision of, let's say, white Negro. So it's kind of white Negro in comparison to this black, into this white rich man on the left. And similarity of this oxymoronic way of thinking we can follow as well in the pictures by Man Ray, like here in Noir and Blanche, but not a few only know that it has as well its negative print, like here when here we have on the right, for example, it's the black Europe and white Africa or white primitive, woman which is, or man which is objectified, and object which is more like man-like. So this oppositional states are going on over here, and the most striking examples are again in some movies. We have here still from For Mittagsbuch by Hans Richter, a very interesting story about guns revolving against humans in this case, or something very close to it in Polish avant-garde cinema, Adventures of Good Citizen by Stefan and Franciszka Temerson, when the normal, typical, usual grey citizens start to walk backwards. So it's something that could be compared with this carnival rites, like he's kind of revolving against the world which is very conventional, typical, but this revolving allows him to for kind of liberation that he gets thanks to that. And the last subject here is a question of the body. So the body here on the right, these are my inversions, so it's not how it looks like. Artists from 20s and 30s, they produce negatives of women body. And for me, it was something that create new vision of the women body. So it's something that contradicts the very long patriarchal tradition of showing woman objectified, depicted to stimulate men's vision, because that's how body was often represented. It was often kind of part of feminist critic in history. Here we have, for example, the case of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy again, when this body in negative doesn't seem to be attractive in any way. It seems to be like stone-like a little bit. So it reminds us the sculpture, this normal resting face seems to be like hurting on the left picture, and obviously we cannot imagine nobody watching, for example, negative porn film. It has no sense in a way. So that's how it works with negative acts, nudes, with which just were created to create new tradition in art. And to for the last sentence in the dictionary called Oxford Companion to the Photograph, one of the, I won't mention the name, but one of the obviously not very brilliant scientists tried to describe negative, but he didn't actually. He only said that it's not useful anymore, and instead of defining it, he skipped to defining people who use it. So he called them quirky philosophers who define them, or a bunch of enthusiasts who use them. It was like 2004 when this dictionary was edited, and this definition just showed how much the, let's say, tension against negativity and negative itself as a material, and on the other hand, this apology of digital photography take place in this moment, But fortunately, as this last picture can show, the negative does not disappear. It still can be a tool, a convention, and even a material in contemporary photography as something that reminds us this past history of photography, and as well still attracts us as something that is very curious in its form. Thank you very much.